Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. Modern monetary theory, also known as MMT, which is a relatively new school of thought in economics, has been gaining traction among progressives. For example, one of Bernie Sanders' main economic advisors, Stephanie Kelton, who we have interviewed here at the Real News, is one of MMT's main proponents. MMT says that governments can and should create, that is, print, money in order to fund full employment, among other things. The significance is that MMT holds out the promise of fully funding progressive projects such as the Green New Deal, free universal healthcare, and free universal higher education without creating unsustainable debt levels. However, the theory remains controversial among progressives. As a matter of fact, here at the Real News Network, we have featured debates between MMT proponent Randall Wray and one of his main critics, Jerry Epstein. For example, critics often argue that MMT doesn't pay enough attention to the problem of inflation. Also, some critics argue that the theory mainly works in the context of developed economies, but developing economies of the global south cannot apply MMT's principles. Joining me now to present an argument about MMT's limited applicability to developing countries is Matías Vernengo. He has been a consultant to UN organizations such as UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and ECLAC, the Economic Commission on Latin America and the Caribbean. Currently, he is professor of economics at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania and recently co-authored an article together with Esteban Perez Caldente for the Political Economy Research Institute titled Modern Monetary Theory in the Tropics, Functional Finance in Developing Countries. Thanks for joining us today, Matías.
Thank you for having me.
So MMT is rather abstract, I would say, and difficult for most non-economists to understand. So how would you explain it so a non-specialist can understand it?
So I would say there are three things that are central to MMT, modern money theory. In the first place, the notion that if a country has its own sovereign currency, they cannot default in that currency. If I tell you that I have a debt and that debt is in dollars and I'm the entity that produced dollars, then there can be no default in your own sovereign currency. So that's the number one proposition of MMT, which refers to that functional finance idea that it's in the title of our paper that you cited. So, and that's mostly what we discussed. So can you default? Can countries, or the fact that the countries cannot default implies that you can do fiscal policy relatively freely, as you suggested, with the ideas of progressive projects like the Green New Deal and free free education or free college education and so on and so forth. So the other two are less relevant from my point of view for this discussion, but they're interconnected. One is the idea of chattel money, the idea that the state, behind sovereign currency is the power of the state. So the state is the entity that determines in what token essentially we pay taxes. So the U.S. government says you pay in dollars, and dollars. The U.S. government says since 1971 it's not tied to gold, and that's it. You pay in dollars. And the government has the power to do so. So it's chattel money. So chattel money is obviously connected to the idea that you cannot default in your own currency. So those two ideas are connected. The third is it's more of a program. I don't know that everybody in MMT necessarily would put emphasis on that, but I believe they do. It's the idea of a job guarantee program that it's, for example, in the platform of Bernie Sanders. So the idea that the state provides jobs, to anybody that is unemployed. So those would be the three sort of main propositions of MMT in my understanding. There might be here and there variations on the topic and policies and so on and so forth, but those are certainly crucial for their arguments.
Now, as I mentioned, your article develops a critique of MMT, saying that not all of its principles are applicable to developing countries. Now, why might MMT be useful for developed countries, but not so useful for developing countries? That is, what's the difference between them and what this means for how MMT can be applied?
So, in a sense, what I would say is we think that some of the principles of MMT certainly apply to developing countries. So Argentina, for example, has issues pesos, and it cannot really default in pesos. I should say, as a sort of an irrelevant aside, which we do have in the paper, and there is a footnote, the government of Argentina of Mauricio Macri, which probably will lose the elections pretty soon by the end of October, has defaulted, has sort of delayed payments and extended, and reduced interest and delayed payments on its debt in pesos. But there was no reason for them to do that. So if you ask me, it's probably to frighten investors that if we lose the elections, look, there might be a default. We're already in trouble because you're planning to vote for the opposition. So in principle, that is valid. The idea that Argentina cannot default in pesos, we don't disagree. We think that that's perfectly all right. I should say also that I tend to agree with MMT offers that the U.S. The biggest risk is by no means inflation. So I don't think that the U.S. is on the verge of having an inflationary crisis, and even less so a significant hyperinflationary crisis like, say, Zimbabwe or Venezuela. So those arguments are, I would say, out of line. I'm not saying that all critics have suggested that, but I'm saying in principle, I'm not concerned with inflation. I think that MMT have a positive effect in moving some of the discussion in advanced economies in the direction of inequality and how fiscal policy can be used to promote certain progressive sort of policies. But developing countries have the following sort of situation. So if you think of a country like, let's forget for a second, I used Argentina as an example, but think of a country like Cuba. Cuba imports oil. It doesn't have reserves of oil. It won't have any time, in the future. So they need to import that. And by the nature of commodity markets, because the sovereign currency globally, the key currency globally is the dollar, the oil is priced in dollars. So they need, even if they don't run current account deficits, they need dollars to buy certain essential things. And so the nature of developing countries is that they come late to the process of development. They need to import essential things. I gave you an example of energy, but normally capital goods. If you're, if you're behind in the process of development, capital goods normally are imported. You need intermediary goods to produce, the actual things that you produce in your country. And all of those things require hard currency, essentially dollars. And so once you have that need, there are problems associated to the management of the balance of payments. So a thing that most MMT authors suggest is, look, if your debt is in pesos, then you don't have to be concerned. And if your currency is floating, so what's a floating currency? Is when the exchange rate, the central bank does not intervene to guarantee a certain exchange rate. And so their notion is that if you're not guaranteed that I'm going to give you for my pesos a certain amount of dollars, and hence you can print as many pesos as you want because you're not going to default in pesos, then you don't have to be concerned with the exchange rate and with the possibility of defaulting. But the problem is that you still need the dollars for buying the essential things. And so you have to be concerned with the amounts of dollars that you have. And that creates a problem for your domestic spending in your own currency. So I'll give you an example. So if you're running out of dollars, like say Argentina is at this moment. Okay, so Argentina doesn't have enough reserves. It's been sustained, the situation, by loans by the IMF. So let's say the IMF does not give Argentina money by December after the election. Argentina doesn't have enough dollars. So the options in facing Argentina are they default in dollars, but they also need to stop importing stuff, because for that they need dollars. And so that throws the economy into recession. So the use of dollars, being concerned with the amount of reserves that you have, is sort of a central thing for developing countries. And also, but I don't want to go too much into this. Also, the issue of the effects of depreciation. So for the most part, MMT authors, although they suggest that a depreciation is not necessarily good for solving balance of payment problems, they, if you look at their writings, if you look at the extensive sort of writings on monetary policy, they have very little to say about exchange rates. But every time they cite exchange rates, they suggest that exchange rates and a depreciation tend to have a favorable effect on the developing strategy of a country, and that again is a problematic proposition.
Yeah. So, I mean, the question, of course, that your paper raises is also, well, what is the alternative? That is, I mean, you're suggesting, it seems, a fixed exchange rate. Although I'm not saying but that's kind of what I'm reading between the lines. If you're saying that, that MMT says that it might work, under certain conditions. But of course, a fixed exchange rate is also a very problematic proposition, and we particularly know it in the case that I'm very familiar with, which is the case of Venezuela, which had a fixed exchange rate from 2003 until very recently, and they basically instituted precisely in order to prevent capital flight. But this created a huge black market, and because they weren't able to provide the dollars that were needed, because they ran low eventually on the dollars that were needed to pay for imports and to supply the market with the demand for dollars at the official exchange rate. So in other words, the whole black market started to take over, and that was a problem as well, which caused inflation, which you talked about already, because essentially it ended up in being a free-floating currency, even though that wasn't the official policy, but that's what they ended up having. So I'm wondering, what, in the context then of the possibility of or the difficulty that is of maintaining a fixed exchange rate and also trying to implement policies that might provoke capital flight, such as taxing the wealthy or taxing foreign corporations. What alternatives does a developing country have that might work?
So there are a few things that I think are important in this context. So first of all, we're not saying that fixed exchange rate systems are necessarily better. So actually, I gave, I think it was 9 years ago or something like that, an interview for your network on the Greek crisis. And Greece obviously doesn't have an exchange rate, but it has something very similar. They have a common currency with the rest of the European, the euro area. And so we're not saying that. What we're saying is that developing countries must manage their exchange rate system. So, which they do, by the way. So that's what they tend to do. Sometimes they do mismanage, as you suggested, in the case of Venezuela, and that's certainly a possibility. But we're not saying that fixed exchange rates are better in general. Mind you, I would like to suggest that historically, the period in which developing countries grew the fastest, which was the period from the 40s to the late 60s, early 70s, which is known as the golden age of capitalism, was also the period of Bretton Woods, in which you had two things. So not just a relatively fixed or managed exchange rate system, so countries could devalue, but also capital controls. And the combination of those two things was sort of favorable. It allowed governments to have lower rates of interest. It allowed them to expand their debt in domestic currency and provide those social policies that were necessary. So, having said that, so that we're not necessarily for fixed regimes, we think that developing countries are correct in managing their currency and in not allowing depreciation. And the fundamental idea is the following, which again I think the fact that MMT authors do mostly because they look at developed countries. So it's somehow US-centric, their analysis. They have less understanding of a typical issue of developing countries, which is that when you depreciate the exchange rate, so when your currency, when the peso is less valuable than the dollar, what happens is that a lot of the stuff that is consumed by workers, by consumers in general, is imported. And so as soon as the dollar, becomes more expensive and the domestic currency depreciated, all of those imported goods are more expensive. And so the real wage falls. So it has a distributive effect. And so normally what you expect from the process of development is that real wages go up, the patterns of consumption in developing countries improve, and so on and so forth. So if you're looking for a development strategy, what you want to do is to some extent allow those patterns of consumption to sort of improve and people have more access to the things that they need. So you improve the quality of their lives. So a depreciation might not necessarily be the best way to achieve that. So how do you solve those problems? So historically, so the countries that were able to deal well with issues of development, catch up, which there are not many. So if how many countries have caught up with advanced economies since, the select group of Western European countries and some Western offshoots like the US and Australia have become developed, started in the 19th century. Very few countries. So it's South Korea, it's Israel, and it's mostly in Asia. So we think mostly, people tend to think of the Japanese experience, although Japan started back in the 19th century, and then South Korea, and now these days they think of China. And so the policies that they pursued is that they do control that exchange rate, so it's managed. They do control reserves. They accumulate significant and large amounts of dollars, and they also use strategies to, industrial policies, interventions to increase their exports, to develop their own national, champions, their companies that are technologically advanced and so on and so forth. So what they need is a developmental state. And in that sense, in the sense that you need a state that is strong and capable of promoting development, I think that there is a sense in which there is a commonality of ideas with MMT. So what they're saying is a strong state in the US can promote all of these policies that promote development per se, meaning that people have access to good healthcare, that people have access to good education, that people have access to employment. And so for developing countries, our point is that requires management of exchange rates and the foreign currency, that you cannot just say, oh, we are looking only at the debt in your own currency and you cannot default on that one, hence you're fine. So you need to be concerned with the currency of the other, the major currencies. So to some extent, depending on which area of the world you are. So I suppose if you are in Eastern Europe, you have to be concerned with the euro. If you are in Latin America, certainly, or Asia, you have to be concerned with the dollar, perhaps increasingly with the yuan, but that's still far away from being a reality. So that's the challenge. How you manage those resources well. I would suggest that some countries have done that reasonably well. Others less so. So Argentina, Venezuela, different sort of situations. So the Argentinian case is certainly much less problematic than the Venezuelan. Have not dealt very well with those issues in the more recent past. I should say in the case of Argentina, when I say the more recent past is the last 4 years in which there was a huge accumulation of foreign debt in dollars. So that should be avoided. And I think that MMT and some of the critics would agree. So we would agree that it's a bad idea to borrow too much in a currency that you do not control.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for now. But I mean, I just want to summarize, I think one of the bottom line lesson one can draw is that in effect, and this shouldn't come as a surprise, but maybe it's also oversimplified, developing countries have less options than developed countries. But we're going to have to leave it there. I was speaking to Matías Vernengo, professor of economics at Bucknell University. Thanks again, Matías, for having joined us today.
Oh, no, thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.
Hey y'all, my name is Tharna Noor and I'm a climate crisis reporter here at the Real News Network. This is a crucial moment for humanity and for the planet. So if you like what we do, please support us by subscribing at the link below. Thank you.